So welcome to this online lecture on literary argumentation or writing a critical analysis paper for a literature class such as English 258. Before you begin, I would recommend that you have read through the handout on literary argumentation, which explains the what, so what, and how argumentative process. If you haven't read that handout completely at this time, I would suggest you pause the video and go and do that and return to the lecture once you've given yourself a chance to look at an overview of what we're going to be talking about. In addition to that, I think it would be a good idea to also take a look at the prompt for critical essay number 1 so that you can see the kind of question that's being asked of you. You can get a sense of the two poems that are available to you to write on, and you can be thinking about what this paper will require you to do. I think having those two documents at your side and having read them before coming to this lecture will help you tremendously. Once you've done that, you can return. So let's begin by talking about the difference between an observation and an argument. And in all of my years of teaching, I think the most pressing difficulty in writing a critical essay is differentiating between an observation, which is really about identification and description, and an argument, which is about setting forth a position, making an interpretation, and suggesting why it matters to somebody's reading and understanding of a literary text. So an observation is a statement. If I said to you, you are listening to a lecture right now, or Professor Zisk is using a blended class because he's away at a conference, or it's unseasonably warm for the end of February, all of those are observations. They're statements, they're correct statements, but they describe something that's going on. In other words, they're statements that summarize or paraphrase, but they don't usually go beyond the obvious. Yes, it is unseasonably warm for February 23rd. Yes, I am using a blended module because we can't have a face-to-face meeting for class. So I'm giving you a summary of a fact, I'm giving you a paraphrase of a situation, but I'm not going beyond that. So how would that translate into the situation of a literary analysis paper? Well, a student could write a paper that essentially says Shakespeare uses nature imagery in Sonnet 18, or frankly, any author uses any kind of imagery in any text. Emily Dickinson uses nature imagery in Because I Could Not Stop for Death, or Galway Kinnell uses nature imagery in Blackberry Eating, or Sir Philip Sidney uses images of pregnancy in the sonnet Loving in Truth, which we discussed last time. All of these are observations. They're not arguments. So why are they observations and not arguments? When you make a statement such as Shakespeare uses nature imagery in Sonnet 18, you're identifying correctly something about the poem. That yes, indeed, there is nature imagery present here, and you're directing the reader's attention to those images of nature. But you're not suggesting what the nature imagery does to make meaning or shape an interpretation. And that's the crucial difference. The observation just states that images of nature or nature imagery are present in the poem. An observation would state that there are an abundance of metaphors in a text. An observation would state that an author uses figurative language to characterize a particular person, place, or thing. But the observation doesn't suggest why it matters to our understanding of the text at hand. And that's the crucial difference. So before you move on, you want to appreciate the fact that an observation is not wrong, but it's not an argument. If you were to suggest in your essay simply that Shakespeare uses nature imagery, I would say this is an observation and it's not an argument. It would produce at best an average or a C-level paper. It would be nowhere near the kind of intense argumentative analysis that you'd have to offer for a B paper or an A paper. You want to move beyond observation. You want not only to direct your reader to what is happening in a literary text, but you want to suggest why it matters. And in the kind of critical analysis paper, which focuses on time and the passage of time, you're not only going to want to say that Shakespeare's Sonnet 15 or Robert Pinsky's poem Waiting is about time. That's an observation. Why does that matter? What does the speaker suggest about time and the passage of time? And why does that matter within the poem? And we'll talk about more in more detail the why does it matter component in a moment. An argument also sets forth a position and makes a claim about a text. In the case of literary analysis, this argument is going to take shape in the context of an interpretation. An argument also needs evidence to make it persuasive. You will need, as the writer, to bring quotations from the text to the reader's attention and then show the reader, as we've been talking about, how the formal features of that text make its meaning. Arguments are generally more complex and they have more at stake for our understanding of a literary text. So again, to go back to the initial example, saying that Shakespeare's Sonnet 18 contains nature imagery is a correct observation, but it doesn't really tell us how appreciating the nature imagery in that poem is going to help us understand what that poem means or what the speaker is trying to accomplish. Now, a few of you have asked in office hours and over email, and it might have crossed your mind, well, isn't an argumentative essay just a longer explication? Because you've already done explication. Let's just go back to that handout that I distributed earlier in the term, where I tried to give you a long view of literary arguments. And we talked about how in this class we began with annotation, and that annotation marking up a text, getting a sense of which words and figures of speech are important, leads us to close reading, where we identify similes, metaphors, metonymies, metrical patterns, rhyme schemes, the speaker and what the speaker is up to. And we start to think about not only where those figures of speech and formal elements are present, but how they work. And that's where we come to explication, where we synthesize our close reading into a cohesive analysis, where we not only say, here's a simile, here's a metaphor, here's an example of iambic pentameter, here's an example of an octave and a sestet if we're reading a sonnet, but we start to analyze how those figures of speech and formal elements produce meaning. And that's what you've done twice now, and that's what you'll do when you explicate either Sonnet 15 by Shakespeare or Robert Pinsky's Waiting for your next explication. When we move into analysis and critical argument, so with this paper and this workshop, we're building on annotation, close reading, and explication to get to the final stage, which is critical argument. When we move to argument, we're shaping an interpretation of a text, and we're supporting that interpretation with evidence and analysis. So an argumentative essay is unlike an explication because an explication is simply a line-by-line analysis of the key figures of speech and formal elements in a text. It does not present an argument, claim, or position. So when you wrote about Langston Hughes's I Too, you certainly may have pointed out to elements of diction or syntax or figures of speech that provided insight into the speaker's conflict, the speaker's struggle as an African American in a society of white privilege. But you weren't making an argument, say, about what that speaker was saying about what it means to live in a society governed by white privilege. Or you weren't making an argument about how Langston Hughes's poem participated in a literary movement aimed at making a political statement and working for social change. You simply identified the figures of speech, you analyzed them, and you showed how form produces meaning. In an argumentative essay, you would want to make a more nuanced interpretation about the text and about what the text is doing. The argumentative essay, though, incorporates explication because an effective argument is going to take shape around textual evidence. So if you're going to make an argument, say if you wanted to argue about Langston Hughes's I Too, that this poem dramatizes the intense emotional, political, and artistic conflicts faced by an African American artist living in a culture of white supremacy or living in a culture dominated by white privilege, that would be an argument because you would be making the case that this poem not only exists unto itself, but that it dramatizes something larger than it, that it provides insight into how a particular speaker is looking at art in a particularly political way. And to make that argument, you would need to provide textual evidence from the poem to support your claim, and you would have to analyze that evidence through close reading. So that's where your explication skills will come in. Once you've set the argument down, once you've gathered the textual evidence, you then need to do something with that textual evidence. What do you do with it? You close read it, and you bring to bear on the textual examples the skills that you've practiced in your explication. So at this point, I would invite you maybe to pause and to just reflect on the differences between an explication and an argument, namely that an explication surveys the figures of speech and the formal elements in the poem and suggests how form relates to content, and that a critical argument or analysis paper sets forth a position, makes a claim, explores a critical problem using textual evidence and close reading. So they're related, but they're not the same. And this brings us just to a general question: what makes a critical analysis essay? In other words, what are the things that you need to analyze a literary text and make an argument about it? You need a claim. You need an argument. You need evidence, as I've suggested. What details from the text will you present in support of your position? And then you will also need to produce analysis. As English majors, as literary scholars, we work with evidence through analysis. Once we gather the textual support, we can't just let it sit on the page. We have to do something with it. And what do we do with it? We close read it. We explore, as you've been doing in your explication, how form produces content, and in this case, how the formal and figurative features of the poem produce the content that supports the very argument that you're trying to make. So in a critical analysis essay, your analysis is always going to be put forth in service of demonstrating your argument. So argument, evidence, and analysis make up the critical essay. And if you're following along on the handout that I distributed, you'll see halfway down through page 1 the little box where I suggest that a critical analysis essay is made up of argument plus evidence plus analysis. Many of you probably came to UMass Dartmouth, came to this course, having learned the 5-paragraph essay, which is basically an opening paragraph that sets forth a thesis statement, and then 3 body paragraphs that offer 3 different examples in support of that thesis statement, and a concluding paragraph that ties it all together. And my position on the 5-paragraph essay, it's drawn, a diverse range of responses. Some folks really like it for its discipline and its structure. Others find it too limited. I'm sort of in between. I think the 5-paragraph essay offers a very useful model for thinking about an organized argument and organizing an argument. But I also think now that we're doing university level work, we need to expand it. We need to move beyond it. We need to allow for sufficient complexity and nuance in framing our ideas and thinking about our analysis. So one shift that I'd like to suggest in the way that you think about essay writing is to think less in terms of a thesis statement and more in terms of a thesis paragraph. One of the downsides, in my own view, of the 5-paragraph essay is that it suggests that you can fit your entire argument into a single sentence, or maybe 2 sentences at best. And I think if you're making a meaningful argument that is complex and that has something to say about a literary text, you're going to need more room. So I would urge you to think not in terms of a thesis sentence or a thesis statement, and more in terms of a thesis paragraph, that the first paragraph of your essay bears the burden of introducing the general direction of your argument, number one. Number two, suggesting why this argument matters. And number three, to preview how you as the writer are going to demonstrate this argument. What are you going to focus on? What aspects of the text are you going to bring to our attention for close reading and analysis? So these three components can be translated into what I call the what, the so what, and the how. And that's what I mean when I talk about what, so what, how argumentation. That in the first paragraph of the paper, you're going to combine the what, the so what, and the how components into a cohesive whole. This will stand as the first paragraph of your paper, and it will introduce the general topic, it will suggest why you claim this argument matters, and it will preview how the paper will demonstrate that argument. And I would venture a guess that if you can do this not only in this class, but in any English class, or really in any class where you're doing textual analysis and argument, your reader will be completely satisfied. Because when a writer can introduce a topic, suggest why it matters, and go about demonstrating it in a logical and sophisticated way, that writer's argument becomes more persuasive, right? And that's one of the real world applications of this course, and it's one of the virtues of majoring or minoring in English, that part of what we're doing here is learning not only how to write, but also how to think and how to speak. That if you have something to say, before you put it out into the world, you need to think about it, you need to frame it in a general way, the what, you need to suggest why it's important, the so what, and you need to have a plan for how you're going to go about convincing your reader that it is persuasive, and that is the how. So together, the what, the so what, and the how combine the thesis paragraph. And at this point, we're going to explore very briefly each component of the thesis paragraph, the what, the so what, and the how, so that you can have a sense of what exactly goes into each. Let's begin with the what. The what statement is the first step in your argument, and it introduces, in relatively broad terms, the general topic of your essay. And the what will also identify the text and the authors you are writing about. So one thing I'd like to say from the start is that this thesis paragraph is a sort of contract or agreement with your reader. Think about it this way. When you write the thesis paragraph, you're laying out a set of plans and a set of conditions, and you're asking me, the reader, to accompany you on this journey of 3 to 4 or 5 to 6 or 10 to 12 or 20 to 30, however long it might be, pages. And you're going to suggest to me that as a result of the time that I put into reading the essay, I'm going to walk away learning something about this text or set of texts that I didn't know before. And in order to make good on that promise, you need to identify exactly what you're going to talk about, why it matters. In other words, why should I invest my time in reading this essay? And then you're going to give me a roadmap, a sort of built-in GPS system of where we're going to go on this journey, point to point to point, to prove this argument. And the first thing that you have to do is introduce your topic, and in the case of a literary analysis, introduce the texts and the authors you're writing about. And here's where observation can be really useful, because in 9 cases out of 10, the what statement is going to be, at the most basic level, an observation. And that's completely okay, because it's just one part of a bigger thesis paragraph. So I've given you 3 sample what statements here based on poems that we've talked about. Shakespeare's Sonnet 18 exhibits a consistent pattern of nature imagery. Galway Kinnell's Blackberry Eating uses nature imagery, particularly of blackberries, to explain the poetic process. Looking at the poem that we just talked about on Wednesday, Sir Philip Sidney's Loving in Truth expresses a speaker's desire to use poetry to win the affection of his beloved. All 3 of these statements, though different texts, different authors, different focal points, all 3 of these statements introduce a general topic. In the first one and in the second one, I, the reader, become aware of at least three things. I know the author, and I know the text, and I also know the general topic, nature imagery, that the writer is going to be talking about. In the third example, I also know the author and the text, and I know that the writer is going to be exploring a connection in the poem between poetry or writing poetry and frustrated love. That's about as good as you can do in what statement. Now pause here and think about this. This is where many student papers go downhill. They go downhill because students confuse a what statement for what comes next, which is the so what statement. Let me repeat that. The easiest way to write a C paper or below is to stop right here at the what statement. To stop at saying Shakespeare's Sonnet 18 has nature imagery in it, and then go on to catalog all the examples that you can of nature imagery. In effect, what you've written there is an explication. And then as an explication, it would succeed. But as a critical argument, it fails. Why? Because there's no position. There's no claim. There's no so what at stake in this argument. All you've done is observe something about the poem. You haven't suggested why it matters. It's nice for me to know that Sir Philip Sidney's Loving in Truth expresses a speaker's desire to use poetry to win his beloved's affection. But imagine me standing over you as you write that saying, so what? Why should that matter? Why should I care? What am I going to learn as a result of this connection? So that's why we have to build a bridge between the what statement, the observation, the general topic, and the so what statement. And the so what statement is the hardest to arrive at. It takes the most time and the most amount of thought because this is where you have to suggest point blank why your argument matters. So to take us forward in the context of the paper that you're about to write, we know, and this is something that you could say in your what statement, that each of these poems, Shakespeare's Sonnet 15 or Robert Pinsky's Waiting, is about time and the effects of its passage. We might even state in the what statement that the speaker sees the passage of time as either a positive or a negative thing, whichever you want to argue. But that's not enough. What you need to suggest in your essay is why that matters. If time and the passage of time is seen as positive or negative, what does that help us to understand about the speaker and about the text that we're reading? What will your argument, as that third bullet point states, illuminate about the texts and contexts in question? What does it help us to understand about the characters or the speaker, the plots, the themes, the historical contexts, and the critical problems posed in the text? Before we go to some examples, I want to say this in order to clarify what I mean by a so what. One student asked me once, well, how big does the so what have to be? In other words, if you really wanted to take it to, the farthest level, does a single poem have the ability to change the world? In other words, could you say that because the speaker of Shakespeare's Sonnet 15 represents the passage of time in a certain way, it suggests that we've completely got our understanding of time and mortality and life on this earth wrong? Well, you could argue that, but you also want to narrow your focus. So for our purposes in a literary analysis course or in a course on Shakespeare or a course on Chaucer or a course on the 20th century novel, you want to think about how far you can actually go in the page length that you've been given. So in a 3 to 4 page essay, or even a 4 to 5 page essay, you're probably going to want to focus your so what into a reasonable proposition. So in this case, you want to tell us not so much about what the poem does in the world, but what does your argument about the poem tell us about the poem's larger meanings, about the speaker's situation, maybe about the craft of poetry or the nature of time in general. There needs to be a degree of narrowing and focus involved in putting forth a really compelling so what. Maybe the best way to illustrate this is to look at a couple of examples. And what I'm doing in this lecture is using the same three texts over the course of the what, the so what, and the how to show you how we would build the argument. So for example, if we wanted to say that Shakespeare's Sonnet 18 employs nature imagery, if that's our what, here's how we would then build on the what, which we've already stated, to craft a so what. And again, remember, in the so what, we're answering the very basic question, why does it matter for our understanding of the poem that Shakespeare uses nature imagery? Shakespeare's Sonnet 18 employs nature imagery for two key reasons. The speaker first characterizes his beloved as more beautiful than even the most perfect natural elements and seasons. By showing the beloved how she eclipses nature's beauty, the speaker also suggests that nature is itself imperfect because it can decay, diminish, or fade. By contrast, the speaker outlasts nature's course because the speaker's poetry makes her eternal. Thus, it is the writing of poetry and not the beauty of nature that reigns supreme. Notice how far we've come here from just there's nature imagery in this poem. We begin with that observation in our what statement, and then in our so what statement, we expand basically to say that yes, there is nature imagery in the poem, but once we start to examine the nature imagery, we understand that it's used not to glorify nature, but to glorify the beloved, and beyond that, that the beloved gains eternity through the writing of the poetry, so that it's poetry and not nature that reigns supreme here. Let's look at the third example, Sir Philip Sidney's sonnet. We began by saying in our what statement that Sir Philip Sidney's Loving in Truth expresses a speaker's desire to use poetry to win the affection of his beloved. In our so what statement, bullet number 3 here, we could then say, while the speaker labors ardently to use words to gain his lover's attention and seek her pity, the poem reminds us that the speaker, quite ironically, needs the beloved to reject him. For it is only through the rejection that the speaker poet can meet the demands of his muse, who commands him to write more poetry. Once the beloved requites the speaker's desires, the need to write poetry is lost. Thus, a poem seemingly about a speaker using words to gain love becomes, in this analysis, a poem about a speaker who uses love to generate art. Now think about that. We discussed this poem in class on Wednesday, and we didn't quite get here. But we did talk about unrequited love, and we did talk about how the speaker was, I think it was Katie who suggested that the speaker was talking about writer's block and the struggle to find the fit words to paint the blackest face of woe in an effort to win his beloved's affection. But if we think about it from the perspective offered in this argument, what the speaker is commanded to do by the muse is to write poetry. And the speaker writes poetry in order to get his beloved to return his affections. And once the beloved says, yes, I love you, the speaker has no need to write any more poetry. But what we know is that this poem is the initial poem in a sonnet sequence, which means that we need more poetry. In fact, 108 poems follow in Sidney's Astrophil and Stella. So what this writer is suggesting here is that once the beloved requites the speaker's desires, the need to write any more is lost. So it's not that the speaker is using poetry to get love, as we think he's saying, but this paper is arguing that the speaker also uses love to generate art. Now, one could disagree with that interpretation, but the fact that one could disagree with it makes it a compelling argument, because now we're prepared for the reader to offer us evidence for how this claim could be persuasive. And that's when we move in to the how component. So before we get there, let's just review. The what introduces the general topic, usually in one sentence. The so what suggests why it matters to our understanding of the text, what it's going to illuminate about this text or its characters or its plots and themes that we haven't thought about before. And then the how is really the easiest part, because the how suggests simply how you're going to go about launching your discussion. So in the last component of your thesis paragraph, you want to briefly present the topics, the literary terms or figures of speech, the aspects of poetic form, the characters, scenes, or issues that you're going to cover in your paper. This is your built-in GPS system. You put this statement at the beginning of your paper to let your reader know we're going to go here, and then we're going to turn there, and then we're going to make another turn here, and then we're going to come to this final point here. To translate that, maybe you're going to say that in order to generate this argument, I'm going to examine Shakespeare's use of simile and metaphor, along with his use of iambic pentameter and the tone that the speaker adopts in this poem or in this part of a play. And then the reader has a clear idea of exactly what aspects of the text you're going to look at in order to prove your argument. When we get to novels and plays, you might decide to structure your paper around certain scenes or episodes. So you could say this argument will be organized around 3 key episodes. Say, character A and character B's conversation in Act 1, followed by character B's conversation with character C in Act 2, and then we'll look at, all of the characters' involvements in Act 5. So you could organize the paper that way as well. There's no right or wrong way to do this, except to suggest what you're going to focus on in your paper. And I'd also like to point out in this final bullet point, the order of topics that you present in the how statement should correspond to the order in which they are discussed in the paper. So if you say you're going to talk about simile and metaphor and then meter and then tone, logically, you would want the paper to begin with simile and metaphor and then go to meter and then turn to tone. So again, let's look at examples. Let's just go back to the Sidney poem. You can look at the other two on your own briefly, but let's just go back to the Sidney poem where we've talked about how the paper is arguing that the speaker is not using poetry to gain love, but rather is using love to write more poetry. The writer could say, in this paper, I will examine Sidney's use of paradox, metonymy, and metaphor, along with his use of iambic hexameter as opposed to iambic pentameter, to illustrate how the speaker is more interested in using frustrated desire to generate more poetry than he is in using poetry to win his beloved's affection. So in that how statement, we have an idea of the tropes that the writer is going to focus on, paradox, metonymy, and metaphor, as well as an element of meter to prove this argument that the speaker is interested in using desire to write poetry more than he is in using poetry to win his beloved's affection. And if you combine then the what statement, Sir Philip Sidney's Loving in Truth, expresses a speaker's desire to use poetry to win the affection of his beloved, with the so what statement, while the speaker labors ardently to use words to gain his lover's attention and seek her pity, the poem reminds us that the speaker, quite ironically, needs the beloved to reject him, for it is only through the rejection that the speaker-poet can meet the demands of his muse, who commands him to write more poetry. Once the beloved requites the speaker's desires, the need to write poetry is lost. Thus, a poem seemingly about a speaker using words to gain love becomes, in this analysis, a poem about a speaker who uses love to generate art. And then finally, we know that the writer will examine Sidney's use of paradox, metonymy, and metaphor, along with his use of iambic hexameter as opposed to iambic pentameter, to illustrate how the speaker is more interested in using frustrated desire to generate poetry than he is in using poetry to win his beloved's affection. So the idea here is that you combine the what, the so what, and the how in no more than 3 to 5 sentences total. And that combination of the what, so what, how elements gives you your thesis paragraph and ensures that you've introduced a topic, that you've suggested why this topic matters to our understanding of the text, and you've articulated how you're going to go about generating that discussion. The last point is the body paragraphs. And the body paragraphs are really the nuts and bolts of your essay. Once you have the argument in place, you then have to launch a discussion, and in this case, that discussion is going to be generated in terms of close reading of your textual evidence to support that argument that you made in the thesis paragraph. So the body paragraphs will demonstrate and develop your argument, and it will go into some detail on the points outlined in the how component. Every body paragraph should relate to the argument. So the key here is whatever textual analysis you provide, whatever evidence you offer, whatever quotation you present from the text, it should relate in some way back to the how statement. So if you say you're going to talk about simile, you should identify several examples of simile, and you should analyze them in service of your argument. So every bit of analysis in every body paragraph should present textual evidence and close read it in relation to your argument, because it's your job to prove to me, the reader, based on your close reading of the textual evidence, why your argument is persuasive. And throughout the paper, you want to be using close reading as you have in your explications. This is where the explication skills come full circle. You don't simply want to paraphrase the text. You don't simply want to say that Shakespeare or Sidney uses simile or metaphor to make the idea more compelling or to express the speaker's sadness. That's paraphrase. You want to analyze specific similes and metaphors, quote the lines, talk to me about the relationship between tenor and vehicle, and demonstrate how the simile and metaphor is making meaning in line with your argument. That's analysis. And as I say here, the bumper sticker version is paraphrase leads to C papers because it's average thought. Analysis leads to A papers because that's where the compelling thought emerges. Just a few last notes. Body paragraphs should be logically organized, and as I've already suggested, they should follow the sequence of what you lay out in the how component. I also want to suggest that in the fourth bullet point here, I'll come back to the third, paragraphs should focus on a single idea or a single part of a more complex idea. And this is where I also break with the 5-paragraph essay. If you say you're going to talk about simile in the poem, it's unlikely that you're going to be able to contain a meaningful analysis of several similes into a single paragraph. Maybe you could, but it might be more effective to break that down into several related paragraphs. So in general, each paragraph should focus on a single idea or a single part of a more complex idea that advances your argument. So if you find that a paragraph is covering 3 points, you might want to step back and break it up into 2 or 3 paragraphs that are connected, instead of trying to lump everything together in one giant paragraph. And that's where transition sentences become important in number 3. That as you move from paragraph to paragraph in the body of your essay, and I know I'm covering ground here from English 101 and 102, so please forgive me, this should be review. You want to show your reader how you're building on what you've said already and how that prepares us for what we're going to take up in the paragraph that follows. So if you think about transition sentences as driving on the highway, and you're driving along 195, you're going 65 miles an hour, and you approach your exit. You're getting off exit 12A to come to UMass. You can't maintain 65-mile-an-hour speed on the exit ramp. You will crash your car, or you'll cause an accident, or you'll at least spin out. So you need to gradually slow down. You need to take that 65 first down to 45 maybe, and then down to 35, and then eventually, as you make that rather tight turn, down to 20 or 25, so that you can move along and then accelerate toward your next destination. Transition paragraphs are like exit ramps. They slow the reader down. So once you end a paragraph, at the beginning of the next paragraph, you need to build some kind of bridge that connects back to what you've talked about and moves us to the next point that ensues. And that will keep your paper united and logical. And then lastly, when you introduce quotations from the text, which you need to do in order to provide textual evidence, be careful not to simply plop them down into your paper, whereby you end a sentence, you give us a quotation, and then you move on. You want to introduce the quotation to your paper. This is another transition movement. So instead of just quoting line 1 of Shakespeare's Sonnet 15, say, as Shakespeare writes in line 1, or in line 12, the speaker says this. Every time you have a quotation in your paper, you should have a little clause that comes before it to introduce it. Otherwise, it breaks up the flow of your paragraph. So that's the end of this brief overview on literary argumentation. I want to end by simply summarizing that a thesis paragraph combines the what, the so what, and the how elements, which really, to make it simple, sets forth an observation about a text, suggests why that observation matters, that is, what does it illuminate about a text, what does it help us understand, what will your interpretation do to teach us something about the text that we haven't thought about before, and how will you go about analyzing the text to make your argument persuasive. So, moving forward on Monday, what I would like you to do, or for Monday, what I would like you to do, as I've explained in class, is to take critical essay number 1, where you're asked to write about the representation of time and the passage of time in either the Shakespeare sonnet or the Pinsky poem, and draft a thesis paragraph that combines the what, the so what, and the how elements. And chances are this paragraph will go through a number of revisions. Chances are that you'll have a pretty easy time writing the what statement and a fairly easy time thinking about the how statement because you have so many tropes and figures and aspects of poetic form at your disposal. The so what is going to take time. It's going to take thought and it's going to take development, probably over the course of our workshop on Monday and in conference with me in office hours. You're not tied to any of this. Your topic and your argument, your so what can change. But what you want to start doing is putting yourself through the motions of thinking in terms of what, so what, and how, so that you don't simply write a paper for a critical essay that says Shakespeare's Sonnet 15 is about the passage of time. Indeed, that's true. But how is time represented? And what does that mean for our understanding of the text? How will you go about analyzing the poem to make your interpretation persuasive? That's where we want to get. So I wish you luck. Please email me if you have any questions, and I will see you in class on Monday.